Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very exciting session. We've started the session slightly unconventionally by playing a piece of music by Bach and conducted by one of our speakers, Kutlwana Mosote. The title of today's session is The Essentials, the Arts, the Music, and the Food of Life. Just before we begin, however, I would like to get some housekeeping notifications out of the way. Would we mind just sharing the housekeeping slide quickly? Thank you. So today's discussion will be recorded, as we've done with our other webinar sessions. And by attending the session, you are consenting to this recording. And we're going to post this onto our website called Witswetu, where we've got a list of all the other events that have come before. And at the end of the discussion, we will be taking some questions. So please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box or to use the chat function. And please also feel free to direct any of your questions to one or more of the speakers, and they can answer them a little bit later. We'd also like to encourage you to have a look at some of the past discussions that we've had and our upcoming events by visiting our website. And you can even subscribe to the website. It's called Witswetu. We'll put the link in the chat. We've also recently developed an Instagram post where we are uploading different events in our department. And the tag there is DFMPC, which is short for Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, DFMPC Wits. So we'd encourage you to follow that. Okay, thanks very much. You can put down that holding slide. So welcome again to the session. My name is Stephen Pensen. I am a lecturer in the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, and I'm teaching on a very exciting course at the moment called Health System Sciences, a discipline of study that we are developing in our faculty. And in the spirit of interdisciplinarity, and as a Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, we feel it is important to think about health in its most holistic sense, and to think about the art of medicine as an act of listening, hearing, communicating, and feeling. And we are also developing an exciting field of inquiry in the Wits Faculty of Health Sciences in the medical humanities. It's a discipline that provides insights into the human condition, into the lived experiences of our patients and practitioners, into experiences of illness and well-being, as well as a critical insight into the nature of professionalism and the structures underlying medical practice. And central to this line of inquiry is a perspective that the arts reveals about people's lived experiences, as art and music are at once experiential, temporal, and performative. It is with this in mind that we've invited three wonderful and exciting speakers to share their insights into some of the challenges that they've experienced and some of the innovations that have emerged as a consequence of the current pandemic. I'd first like to start off by welcoming Kutlwana Mosote, as well as Sarah Hallett and Gavin Craston onto this call. Kutlwana is well known to me as I play in the Johannesburg Symphony Orchestra under his baton, and I've had the privilege of being directed by a person whose passion for music is also a source of personal inspiration. Being born into a musical family, Kutlwana Mosote is himself a musician, a composer, a conductor, as well as a host on radio. You might know Kutlwana from Classic FM back in its heyday, as well as SAFM. I'd also like to welcome Sarah Hallett, who is the founder and director of the Meta Foundation and the managing director of August House. Sarah is going to be interviewing, quote unquote, Gavin Craston, who is an artist working predominantly in the live performance art, and is currently the winner of the Standard Bank Young Artists Award for Performance Art. So welcome to you both. So at the start of the session, we were listening to this well-known piece, which Kutlwana was directing. It's air on the G string by Bach. Let me hand over to you, Kutlwana, to give some of the context to this video and to share your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Hello, everyone. That video, of course, a well-known piece. So I thought it would be great to get us started off with something to just get us into a kind of beautiful and creative mood for the discussions we're about to have, but also something quite familiar. And just a little bit of a quirk. It's called air on the G string, and G string is not an undergarment in this case. It's the lowest string on the violin. The piece itself is about 250 years old, by Johann Sebastian Bach, as Stephen said. And there was a German violinist whose name now escapes my mind, who decided he was going to take this quite lush and expressive theme that's in the higher registers of the violin to play it on the lowest string of the violin, which means he would have been playing quite close to his face because the higher you go in the positions, the higher the pitch. So he did this, which is quite a difficult and unnatural thing to do. And hence, it's been called the air on the G string, the lowest string of the violin since then. So just a little bit of a nice story to backstory. You can tell I'm a broadcaster of music as well as being a musician myself. But Stephen, what I really wanted to perhaps to pick up on your intro, what I wanted to share some of my, people in the corporate space speak about pivoting at this time and staying relevant. When you're a musician, especially if you play in an orchestra or even a band, unless you are part of the Rolling Stones, the idea of having a virtual concert and using that as a source of income in these uncertain months, which have now amounted to nearly 2 years, is not a lucrative one unless you are part of an established and really award-winning and a group like that with a huge following. Certainly, if you're a member of, let's say, the Johannesburg or the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestras, your options are limited in as far as how much money you can make from these concerts. So although we've all been accustomed to downloading concerts and supporting a friend paying 100 rand for a ticket, it's no match or competition for some of the more established brands. So only people with huge followings have been able to use these platforms for supplementing income. The other thing that we spoke about previously was my experience with the effect that COVID has had on learning in the creative space. So you will know that, especially the more resourced schools, scores of children take instrumental lessons. Now, some of the discussions I've had with colleagues over the past 20 odd months have been around, wow, initially it was great because children were at home, they didn't have to do extramural activities like sport, and parents in a lot of cases worked from home. So little Johnny was supervised, knew that there was piano, allocation of 10 minutes for piano. And the piano teacher who was teaching online found that there was a lot of progress that could be measured in a very short space of time. So teacher was happy, parent was happy, child was probably even happy that there was progress being recorded. However, much of what we do as creatives is very much in community. If you think of choral singing, ensemble singing, it's a social also output, if you like. You learn, you see a different group of people at choir, or in your case, Stephen, as I'm sure a lot of the audience don't know that you're an all right clarinetist, which is how I know you, because you belong to a community orchestra, the Johannesburg Symphony Orchestra, which I conduct every Monday night, and you come and make those, shall we call them, sweet sounds on the clarinet every Monday. So there's a social aspect to that. It's something where you go and do something different. So that was taken away from all of us, right? So much so that even when we had a scheduled power cut on Monday night, and we should have put up the picture, we all decided we are going to bring music stand lights so that we would definitely rehearse. We've been starved of it. So we've all missed that. And in terms of our well-being, I think we have still to count the cost of what COVID-19 and lockdowns have done to A, the development of children, B, what sort of musician will be churning out in 10 years' time because of this gap that we're still trying to navigate. That although, as I said, initially we were excited that, wow, the children are practicing, but they tune out after a while because the social aspect of ensemble and that routine of it, parents then go back to work, kids go back to school, but choir practice and ensembles are still not happening. So what's the cost of that? And of course, lastly, not to overstate the obvious, I can tell you from my own point of view, and I'm sure Gavin and Sarah will also speak about it. our livelihoods have been decimated. I mean, I'm not even going to go there. And it's a real tragedy because it takes so much work, as it does in any other field. But in this country, the performing arts are not very well supported by the government and by corporates. And so when you gain momentum like some of us have been doing the last few years, and to have literally the rug pulled from under your feet has been quite a challenge. So those are just my initial reflections.
Thanks for that, Koklana. And I think it is probably something that resonates with many artists and musicians. And I'm glad you made reference to our rehearsal in the dark, where we are currently rehearsing for a Christmas concert. We at that time of the year where, well, we actually are not calling it a Christmas concert. We're calling it a holiday concert because we're trying to be inclusive of broader society and to also find ways of bringing people together to celebrate it. Having seen throughout the year and moving into a time when we can relax a little bit and those kinds of performances for a member of a community orchestra is what we really live for, right? Having a space to play music together. It's something that it happens as a collective. It brings people together. It's something that's experiential and temporal. It happens at that moment. And maybe you could share a little bit more about the differences between having had to move our lives online, where music doesn't happen or it can't be made in these spaces where we are seemingly disconnected. We might be able to see and hear each other, but we don't read each other's body music or body language. Is body music a concept? I think it's a good concept. It's something that you spoke to me about once as a wind player. When you're sitting next to somebody, you breathe at the same time as the person next to you. You can't do that online because you're not listening to the person playing. And that makes the music happen. Perhaps you could just share a little bit more around this kind of disconnect or social disconnect and what it means to actually music as an entity bringing people together.
Yeah, so I think thank you, Stephen, and it's all of what you've said. The kind of sanctity of the space as well, the trust that one needs to be able to make music and any art to create something special is because you build a rapport, number one, but you also trust the people that you're with. Where, for example, how we then, so just to illustrate how we would have done a performance online, when I was still at Classic FM, we decided to mark 100 days of the lockdown, that we would do something as a gift for our listeners. Classic FM, the staff was full of musicians, Richard Cox, Shireen Holia, etc. And so we all, our station manager had the idea to do the song called The Morning After from the Poseidon Adventure, I think was the movie in 1974. So I got Tim Molloy, who's somehow part of the Classic FM family at the time. His partner was the producer of Carolyn Stain, who did one of the shows. Richard played piano, I played cello, and my son played violin. He was home, sent home from boarding school. Um, uh, Shireen Holia sang. So we had done that initially, and then to celebrate or to mark the 100 days of the lockdown, we decided to rope in the Johannesburg Philharmonic. And so I think 38 musicians from their own home recorded what I then orchestrated and sent the music to everyone, sent them a click track, right, that they would have to put on headphones and then record into a cell phone, but you don't hear the metronome going, but so that we know we're doing it in tempo, and also then so that it could be edited later this year. So we did that, we packaged it, and we had 38 people playing in concert, as it were. Uh, but Stephen, I can tell you, we played it a lot. It was playlisted a lot because it was our gift to our audience. And every time I saw it on the playlist, I cringed because it's not, and I orchestrated it. So I knew exactly what I had in my head. And it kind of came out 70% that way in terms of what the nuances were, where do you do inflections, the kind of thing you don't even have to, as an orchestra, tell the orchestra, because they're competent musicians. When they listen, they go, this is what we need to do. and they feed off each other. Yours is just to make sure that you coordinate it. So that was, although it worked successfully, and we have a record of it, thankfully, because we can refer to it. Perhaps we can talk on that after, we're out of this pandemic and just, do a retrospective. And a lot of it just goes to show that, yes, you can still go on doing and creating art, but there is a reason why we go to live concerts, even though we have CDs of the same symphony with even better orchestras and conductors from Germany, etc. But nothing beats that experiential, that being there, and the people coughing in the audience that are annoying, and people clapping between movements, if you're a purist. But you still go because you cannot buy that.
Absolutely. I mean, even coming from an okay clarinetist, I've had that experience where where we are, when you're making music, it's a shared experience, and I think that's something that is definitely experienced by people in the healing professions or healing arts in different modalities of healing. There is a reciprocal relationship with the person in front of you, and in some ways, healing can happen, but understanding can happen in that, in the moment, and being able to see the person in front of you, to really hear what is happening. And a lot, I think, with the strains and stresses of this pandemic is that our health workforce is so overwhelmed and so exhausted that the things about the stuff that makes the practice or art of medicine happen, and that kind of relationship which you've just described between musicians that could happen between carer or healer and patient, that's the first thing that falls away. In the same way that recording it online, we lose something. And something we could be very cognizant of in terms of the experiences of health professionals and how patients have also experienced the huge stresses and strains at this point in time. With that in mind, I actually would like to hand over to our other speakers, and please feel free, Sarah and Gavin, to pick up on some of the points that Kutlwano has been mentioning. Let me start with you, Sarah. I know we're going to be unconventional again, given the nature of this discussion. A little back and forth between you and Gavin around your experiences. I'm going to hand over and let you guys fly with this.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess when I was approached for this talk and obviously met all of the other speakers, I really started debating and thinking about this idea of kind of where the art sits in the world, and maybe why it sits where it does. And I'm gonna relate a quote, and then Gavin, I'm gonna just get you to kind of weigh in. Cool. I was listening to Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Each Pray Love. She's got a wonderful TED talk on creativity. And she was talking about how sort of prior to the Renaissance, creativity was considered something outside of the body. You had a muse or a daemon or what the Romans would call a genius that would allow you to be creative and to find inspiration and make work. It also allowed you to kind of separate yourself from the production of work, because, if your muse didn't show up or your daemon wasn't very good, there wasn't as much pressure on you as a single individual to create. But then she talks about this moment in the Renaissance where we get rational humanism, where we start to really believe that the human being is separate from the gods and the deities. And we start to kind of internalize creativity, which leads us to this point where we think that we now have people who are creative and people who aren't creative, people who are in the arts and people who are in the sciences. And I mean, you've done quite a lot of interactive, experimental, live, performative stuff. And I'm kind of curious how what are your thoughts about that kind of vein of thinking?
Thank you, Sarah. Thinking regarding creativity, you're talking about. Yes, yeah. Yeah, I 100% agree with you in terms of that. We've seen this lovely historical kind of subversion that, creativity is not this godly ordained separate thing. And I've kind of come to understand creativity as a clarion call to take designing very seriously and to really manifest the design process. We can maybe talk about that as worlding or futuring. And I think we are all designers. I'm not talking about I am talking about aesthetic design, but I'm also not talking about aesthetic design. We design relationships, we design care programs, we design recovery and treatment facilities, we design relationships, we design our family. Of course, we design how we're going to put the paint on the canvas and how we're going to point our toe. But it's really about taking that holistic process of creating, of designing, and really it's taking it further than having ideas. I think we all have ideas, and creativity is manifesting those ideas. It's sustaining and maintaining those ideas in order to create, rather in order to problem solve. I think so. I think we are all creative because we all deal with problems, and we all need to solve these problems in order to future our world, right? And I think we can only do that with creativity. And in that way, I kind of find this notion of healing and creativity kind of just different sides of the same coin, in a way. Yeah.
Sorry.
No. I mean, something maybe I could come back to you a bit later is I've certainly, my understanding of creativity has shifted as well. And maybe that's something I could ask you a bit later. You work with a lot of artists, and you are quite integral in an ecology of artists with all these different approaches to creativity. And I'm wondering how that has shifted your approach to what you may think creativity is. But maybe we can come back to that later. Sorry if I interrupted you. Sorry.
No. I guess what I was just based on what you were saying, I was thinking about this idea of sort of internal and external, having the idea internally or having a thought or whatever. And then I guess the creative design thing that you're talking about is taking that and making that real.
Yeah.
And the endless iterative process around that is getting it to look like you want it to look in your head, but also learning as you're doing that maybe there's some other things that are more exciting and interesting than what you had in your head, and being okay with that flow, that some of it works, some of it doesn't, and that's okay.
Yes, and I think it aligns very much to almost like a research process in that regard. You're constantly on a journey of becoming, of discovery, and hopefully you do have a network or parameters in place to hold you accountable, so that you're not just doing whatever and harming people and things. But there is this kind of journeying together. And I think this is something that perhaps COVID has and the pandemic has, well, to me, really brought to the front, is how the audience and the artists are kind of having to journey together at the same time. We're both very much operating in an unknown. As much as the virtual gallery is a bit weird for the artist, it's as alienating for the audience. As strange as the digital black box theater Zoom performance is for one side of the curtain, so it is for the other side. And I see there are a lot of concerns about how artists, particularly established artists, who are now going to publicly fail in their experimentation of this new format. But we are also seeing audience go through that similar process of kind of failing forward or stumbling forward, or what I would like to say, designing or researching, futuring this way forward. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whilst the technology certainly has been there for a very, very long time, and in the visual arts, South Africa's been very slow to adopt the kind of online gallery, I guess, space. COVID definitely sped that up. What we have been noticing is that while it was initially embraced, and I think it's here to stay, I don't think that it's disappearing. I think there is a kind of mixed model that people are working their way towards, that it's great that they can see stuff online and interact with it anytime, any time of the day, week, month, whatever. But to physically see the things, to see the artists, to meet the artists is something that they also long for, because we're social human beings, and these things are, I guess from a mental health perspective, what COVID has certainly shown us is that we do need community. We need social engagement and activity to keep our well-being of our brains and our bodies, on track. And that chopping something out so quickly and severely has impacted people terribly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's quite interesting. I've noticed that as much as we are going back to like, the usual art fair model, I've noticed there's been quite a boom in the open studio, the social visit, the circuit, the welcome into my home, like my kind of unmade home, not the prestigious, beautiful, polished home, but come into my unmade home, my studio, see my process. We haven't connected for years now, only digitally. So come, let's rebuild this community. I'm finding a similar sort of hybrid approach in one of the projects I'm working with, which is the Live Art Arcade. And it normally happens physically, where we have these live performances, and now it's happening via video, and it's being uploaded to virtual galleries. So not just playlists, there's still a kind of temporal, spatial, architectural construct in which the audience, almost like Google Maps, can kind of zoom in and journey along. So there's an aesthetic exploration happening in isolation. And there's no like community. But then I noticed the community and the conversation often happens via WhatsApp later or privately. So something very public and something very enigmatic has been made quite invisible and has been kind of reduced to binary code. And so as excited as I am about continuing to extend the capabilities of the virtual, yes, we need to get back into those open studios, into those restaurants and dinners and art parties, and that's our currency is social. It's our knowledge is in touch.
It's an interesting thing for me in some ways. Like, I think for almost, and I'm of a generation where I remember not having cell phones and not having the internet, and and I look at how much technology has impacted us, and it's wonderful, but it has somewhat taken over our lives.
Yes.
And in some ways, this kind of COVID thing is making us draw a line in the sand and trying to go, okay, well, it is a tool and we can use it as a tool, but it doesn't replace everything. And if we're thinking it's going to replace everything, we potentially are in for some trouble, because that's not good for us. We can't hear each other sing. We can't dance in the same way. We can't get the feedback from the audience. We can't understand what's going on because we're in this vacuum. And especially social media is very vacuum orientated. You are with your phone and with these millions of people you've never met, with algorithms that show you only the stuff that they think you want to see. So you're in this kind of vortex, and there is something about getting out of that vortex, which is about expanding your mind and not reducing your mind.
Yes.
It's about spreading ideas rather than, separating out into the right or the left very extensively, opening up things. So I think it is ultimately very crucial. I mean, one of the things that somebody has said here on the chat that I'm going to sort of rephrase in an interesting way. I had this really interesting conversation with a art collector. We were talking about work that was made post the Second World War, and how in auction circles, that is some of the highest commanding value work at the moment, right? And a lot of it was made sort of just after the First World War. So you're looking at sort of 47 to 55 kind of space. And he was saying, do you think that the artists have responded to COVID? And can we see that in their work? And my response was, yes, well, I do think you can't help but respond to it in some way if you're creating work. But I'm not sure, we're so in it at the moment, I'm not sure we're seeing the wood for the trees in terms of what we are making.
Yeah.
And I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yes, no, I agree. I think without a doubt, COVID is So I would like to talk about art. We've got the form and then we've got the content, right? So you've got the form of art. Is it a painting? Is it a dance? Is it a piece of music? And then you've got the content. You know, is it about racism? Is it about sex? Is it about medicine? And I think we are very much responding in our form because we have got no choice, right? So I think we are responding in our form, but not necessarily always in our content. And I think sometimes we're almost so bogged down and have COVID fatigue that the thought of making art about COVID as a subject matter is almost too much. But then I noticed what's really interesting is that people aren't making art about COVID, but rather what has stemmed from COVID. So making art maybe about the job losses that have resulted from COVID, or the recalibration of the family home due to COVID, or the deferral of dreams due to COVID. So I'm not seeing people kind of doing art about ventilators and tests and, you know, this COVID aesthetic. I'm seeing kind of the more insidious symptoms of COVID that people are really speaking to in their content, and then of course in their form. I mean, like things like TikTok have like become a legitimate art form now. I'm also a lecturer at a university, and like TikTok has also become like a research tool now and a lecturing tool. So I think we are naturally responding to these forms. Yeah, and I see another one of the questions asked about like how has this changed output a bit? For me, it's been a bit strange, but maybe for fine artists, it's not that novel. But I'm a live artist. I always work live. Like, if you want my work, that means you want me. You've got to transport home and feed and water me. But now I'm making videos, and for the first time in my life, I'm able to email my artwork, which is very strange for me. So I'm still kind of wrapping my head around that and trying to maybe unlearn and relearn some modalities around labor.
Oh.
If that makes any sense, yeah. But I still have a big question mark there, yeah.
It's not even just, I mean, we're also in this age of kind of this weird thing around ownership. Yeah. So you know, like what is technology doing to ownership? NFTs, which are becoming this big blow up thing in the visual arts, like what does that mean? How many times can I sell it? What, you know, all of how much money can I make from it, whatever. There is a whole shift. And certainly for some of us, it's going to take us a little bit longer because we're in it, to wrap our heads around it. I think one of the things, certainly, just to go back to maybe what we were talking about with the artists and the ecosystem, one of the things that I'm endlessly fascinated with, I see both in the artists and in myself, and I'm not a practicing artist, is how they deal with doubt and rejection. Yeah. And it's a very interesting thing in this moment, because although it's not necessarily that you were rejected for your work itself, kind of the world shut down, theaters, galleries, and in some cases and in some countries, they've chosen to keep other things, other social activities open. So you've had like soccer matches and rugby things going, but you can't go to the theater. So there's been this real kind of societal, for us, reckoning about what society thinks is important.
Yes, yes.
And some things clearly are more equal than others. But this thing about artists have this ability, or they have learned the skill, I think it is a skill, about making stuff, making it potentially badly or getting it wrong or putting it out into the world and the world doesn't want it for whatever reason, and getting up the next day and doing it all over again.
Yeah, yeah.
Like it's psychopathic and something's wrong with us. But it is a really interesting thing, because I think if you look at, like, comparing it to the medical sciences, for example, just look at like the cure for cancer that people have been looking for decades.
Yeah.
And yet those scientists get up every morning and they keep trying to find it, you know, and it works, doesn't work, you know, whatever. So speak to me about your ideas around doubt and rejection in just making work generally, but then also in this moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think doubt and rejection is, again, one side of the other side of the coin. Like you're saying, like doctors do it all the time. When I was in Switzerland at the Hadron Collider, the woman said that basically they splice they collide atoms, but 99% of what they do are just failures and mean nothing.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, this is weird, you know. And then so it's like, I don't know if we put too much pressure on ourselves, because there's an innate. And when I use the word primitive here, I really don't mean any negative associations. I mean primary. I think maybe that's what I mean. There's a very primary urge to create and to make marks. If you like, history has shown us, and all the books show us that regardless of what is at our disposal, we will take that and we will make marks. We will literally mark space with those things. And it will rain and get washed away and be destroyed, and then we will do it again in the next day. And I think it is part and parcel of the thing. However, having said that, our artists are in a very, I can't sanitize it. They're in a very bad emotional space at the moment. And I think there was a situation in the UK that actually brought it home for me. There was a campaign in the UK where they were urging all artists to retrain another trade. And I thought that was absolutely absurd, that someone who has dedicated 20 years of their life, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of rands, to hone in that skill, to literally in this big bad world find their spot under the sun and just make their craft, and in the world of destruction they are creating, and then to be told to go and retrain. And then I ask myself, okay, but what will you do in the next lockdown? Whose books will you read? Whose movies will you watch? Whose clothes will you wear? What paintings are you going to discuss? What music are you going to listen to? How are you going to Netflix and binge? What poetry is going to save you?
Yeah, and I mean, that thing about being unequal, like you're so unimportant in the world that our biggest level of advice for you is don't do it anymore.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
As if it was easy enough to do to begin with, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know, for people who create, and my husband's a screenwriter, he says the most terrifying thing is the blinking cursor on the blank page. You know, and he just says you've got to stare at it until the stuff comes out of you. But it's terrifying. And sometimes it's a paragraph quickly, and sometimes it's like 4 days on one paragraph.
Yes.
It's not an easy thing to do. So for people just to be all like, just give it up, is the most highly insulting thing I ever heard.
Yeah. And I think it's for that reason that we really need to, if we had to speak the nitty-gritty, there are laws currently sitting in Parliament to actually protect artists, to protect copyright, to pay royalties, to pay loyalties, so that our artists don't have to die poor. And we're just sitting on them. And I'm sincerely hoping that all this kind of upsurgence with COVID will spur something on, because I think that is, artists are somewhat immortal. Like they survive despite all the chaos that is happening. I mean, at the moment, our government has completely mismanaged the financial and kind of psychological support offered to artists. And our artists are so punk, they have now turned that into art. You know what I mean? Even their anger has been alchemized into art.
Yeah, I mean, I think so it's definitely been absolutely horrific here, like the livelihoods and things, how artists have been treated by government, but I guess also just by this real lack of understanding from the wider population. So on some level, you know, what happens with Netflix and binge, for example, is that you can sit down and watch an entire series of stuff that in a day, without kind of braining the fact that it's taken somebody 2 or 3 years to make that. So the commercialization of some of our stuff, clothes, you know, whatever the thing is, there's very little consciousness connected to the activity of the watching, especially in the digital space. I think when you are sitting down and you're watching a symphony orchestra or a theatre production, there's a much more immediate consciousness around understanding the work and the time and the effort that has gone into producing the thing that is in front of you.
Right.
But certainly in the digital space, we're like obese children. We just shove it down our throats.
Yes,
we're like,
yes.
it's yummy, let's do it again,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this conversation can definitely go on and on. I think you've brought up no, it's fantastic. I think you brought up some really interesting points, and I've been jotting down a lot of different areas where we could jump off. But the one that really stood out to me is something that we've been teaching in our Faculty of Health Sciences, the work of Howard Phillips, who's an historian of medicine, and he's written specifically about pandemic in South Africa. A fantastic and very digestible book called Plague, Pox and Pandemic. And he prefaces this by saying that there are a number of aspects that pandemics do. He mentions 5, but one, which is very key to what you mentioned, is that pandemics make visible the social fault lines in society, what is important to people and what is not. Where do we invest our energy, our money, our time, and what falls by the wayside? Completely anecdotally, my dear brother is a pilot, was a pilot, and he wasn't told to retrain. He was forced to retrain, and now he delivers packages. It's quite a far cry because necessity requires it. And I think many artists and musicians have also had to be additionally creative. There's a huge amount of strain, and there's I think a huge amount of willpower to maintain a highly creative being. I really loved the link that you drew there, Gavin, between healing and creativity as being different sides of the same coin. And sometimes I feel that healing arts, or the art of healing, Sarah, you brought up this idea of the division between the arts and the sciences. Healing or practice of medicine is often stymied by the practical, the need to follow protocol, the need to follow guidelines, particularly in a time of a pandemic where there's certain things that need to be done first and foremost and all the rest. And also trying to avoid medico-legal repercussions of not having followed certain things. And so allowing the space for somebody to be creative and come up with solutions in that context is sometimes it creates that division between how healing and creativity could be working together and have worked very effectively in many other healing traditions. We have a lot of questions coming through. I think there's a huge amount of interest. I see Sarah, your finger. Please go ahead in response.
I was just going to add in this one totally random fact. But I remember when COVID first started and everyone was talking about how long you had to wash your hands for. And somebody came up with the happy birthday song. I don't know, I'm sure there were plenty of others, but I heard the happy birthday one. And it's a genius way of being creative while doing something completely mind-numbingly dull that you have to do with some level of frequency in a pandemic. And I think that whilst that may not seem like it's a creative solution, that is design thinking applied to something medical. So I think, there are wonderful ways to do this. We've got to stop separating the boxes so that we can think about the answers to these.
Yeah. I read something really wonderful yesterday. It was at an addiction treatment plant, and they've been working with treatment. I was thinking treatment plant, but I mean an addiction treatment program rather, and hospital and clinic. And they've been working with a lighting designer, and they have figured out that using blue lights and very pale blue lights does something to the psychology in the brain that kind of swells the addiction, as opposed to if things were lit and red and whatever. And now they're actually piloting that in bathrooms, and they've noticed that people are doing less cocaine in bathrooms at clubs since. And so to me, it's interesting how these creative offshoots that started in a theater are now, it's those small things,
Absolutely. I love your mention of Happy Birthday, because I can't wash my hands without getting that song out of my head. And in fact, There's been quite a few questions around music that I would like to just bring Kutlwano back into the fore. There's a question here about choral music. Kutlwano having mentioned what's happened to singing. I have friends who sing in a choir. They wear a special choral singing mask. I don't know if it really does anything, but it must be very difficult to breathe and sing at the same time in a choir. The question is, what is happening with South African choral music tradition this Christmas with the long challenge of COVID? We also have a comment about education and music. Millicent says, I'm in education and we have had to change the way we examine music, practical exams, from marking them live to marking recordings. And we find that the emotional aspect that you experience as a marker is completely lost, right? From the recording, learners become very rigid when performing for a camera, unlike when they perform for examiners. And this has an effect on the way that we mark. So the relationship between, in education, even between teacher or marker or audience member and, what happens when we shift that modality. I'd like to just add one more question around music. Surya Kanati, sorry, I can't read this name, apologies, asks, what do you all make of the global tsunami of the South African song Jerusalema? I'm sure you all heard of it, and its associated dance moves. Also a hybrid of forms from across the world, though recognizable as it moved the world, and its pandemic linking forms, meanings, and themes. Can I hand over to Kutlwano, just your thoughts around these questions around music and performance?
Sure. So yeah, with choral music, it's an interesting one because, as you know, we have more, maybe you don't know, there are more people singing in choirs in South Africa than there are people playing football. Because think about it, we all sing at school, there are community choirs, etc., etc. So actually, I'm willing to bet that everybody on this webinar has sung in a choir, but has not necessarily ever put on soccer boots. So there you have it, or any other boots or gloves for that matter. So it's something that we all participate in at some point, and we all can share experiences and the learnings from that. Yeah, and it's a pity because of the very nature of singing and COVID-19. The whole idea of not spreading your droplets everywhere. So you certainly couldn't sing with a mask on. It's not good for you. But there are all these visors and things. It comes back also to something that Stephen touched on earlier. It's that intimacy, that immediateness of knowing when the person next to you takes a breath. Just the size of breath tells you how loud they're about to sing, or that they're preparing to sing a longer phrase, etc. Which are the things that get masked, as it were, under a mask or any sort of visor. So it takes away those the codes that we have as performers, as teammates, etc., etc. But yeah, it's been a pity not to have any of this. I also, for one of the private schools, I was asked in 2019 to come and adjudicate their high school sort of singers, instrumentalists, pop, classical, contemporary, etc., which was great in 2019 because we did it in their chapel. Last year we did it online, and it was awful, guys. I'm sorry to say to the young people, they were still adjusting to this new normal. So this year we've just done it again now in September, and the same kids who are not as prepared and who are not as excited to be performing for a stranger that they didn't know singing at a camera. So they've learned that new language. They've added that to their repertoire of skills to be able to present, as we are learning the etiquettes of this kind of platform, be able to present something and not actually connect to the person on the other side, but knowing that making the connection will help you get a better mark. I don't know if that makes sense. So it is like recording a CD. You kind of have a sense that this is going to be a hit, and so you do it. And so we've all learned those skills, which maybe dovetails into the whole Jerusalem thing. So I think it was a fun thing to do, and it obviously earned the DJ a lot of royalty money. TikTok paid him, YouTube paid him, etc., etc. And I'm not so sure if it's been such a great advert for the level of the arts in South Africa. It's certainly spoken to the level of DJing and producers in South Africa. So it served that purpose, and it was a wonderful movement, and it makes you think of all its predecessors, whether it's the Macarena, that I'm sure all of us are old enough to remember, and with its dance moves. So it was just a continuation of that. I think it was just timed so well for when we were all looking for something to do, when we were cooped up at home, not even allowed to go out and exercise and all of that. So it was, I'm very happy. And maybe these are some of the opportunities that some artists were able to take advantage of. But as just as the last thing to say on this, and Sarah, maybe you can pick up on it again. I liked what you said, the inequality of it, of what these moments Steve said about we learn in a moment of crisis like this, whether it's a war or a pandemic, what people value and what they don't. When there's Busk Aid, which is an international reputation ensemble, or Ladysmith Black Mambazo, they could never have gotten that kind of traction, as opposed to, and nothing against the DJ himself, but I'm sure he has not been working on his craft for 35 years like Mambazo had, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think also just there's like, the fact that you just mentioned, Kutlwana, that, there are more people who have sung in a choir than they have played football. There is also this real lack of understanding around the contribution that the arts in general make to society. So, and I don't think it's a purposeful thing in all cases, although one could argue government should know better. But I think there are these things, like I read an interesting statistic about just how well educated people are in the arts. So we are, the place that most people who work here have masters or PhDs. We're an incredibly smart group of people, and we contribute quite heavily to the GDP relative to the support that we get. So, I mean, when we start to think about those things that do exist, but that people aren't cognizant of, just as you're mentioning about the DJ, there are people who spend their entire lives practicing who are unbelievable, but maybe don't get the marketing support they need, and as such can't make it to the next level. There are these inequalities the whole way through the thing. And I guess just a little bit like Gavin said, I'm hoping that out of this trauma and this time, just like the Second World War did, that we're going to spend the next 5 or 10 years really restructuring our stuff to do it better and to be more supportive and helpful and make a better world.
Yeah, I think...
I was muted, if I may, Steve.
Go ahead.
Make it a better world, I said, just you and me, so I couldn't resist.
I mean, I just have the memories of nurses outside of a hospital doing the Jerusalem dance, and it just made me think, actually, they needed to get out of that place, so they needed to have something fun to do, and that's just a small example of how creating an avenue for freedom and creative expression can really impact people and bring them together and allow people to have some fun. I see that some of the questions have picked up on this discussion around healing and creativity as being part of the same, two sides of the same coin. And also sometimes the distinctions that are made between the sciences and the arts. There's a comment from Jennifer who says, I don't believe that the arts and sciences are so separate. Design is involved in most things, plastic surgery, innovations, and so on and so forth. I might be biased, as I did both music and science for matric and still love music. And we don't want, I think this is a big issue, again, around disparities in the positioning of different fields of practice that the sciences are valued more over the arts, but in fact that we know that distinction is a false dichotomy that's created in terms of how we form knowledge. There's a question from Matthew and from Daniela that I'll put together. Matthew says, I'm interested to know from Sarah and perhaps Gavin as to in what ways the pandemic has materialized in a physical way in creative outputs from artists, visual artists and performers. And Daniela asks, do you believe that constraints help or hinder creativity? Or do they have a way, do they have a push and pull relationship that one cannot exist without the other? Whoever would like to take this, go ahead.
I think in terms of Matthew's question, sorry, we did sort of touch on some of that with Gavin's form and function answer, but maybe you want to pick it up further, Gavin.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry, someone else also just said something, or am I missing something? Yeah, in terms of is the person asking a question actually looking for some like examples of the type of work that happens? So I mean, I know like poetry festivals moved onto Zoom. There were a lot of, there was a trend where people could hashtag their home studio, and you kind of saw people packing away their beds and turning their bedrooms into studios, and then kind of hanging work in their own home and advertising that over Facebook or Instagram. I've seen virtual galleries being kind of built, virtual theaters being built, and a lot of Zoom performances. And something that's come interesting out of these Zoom performances, in theater, we often talk about the beat. You know, you have you deliver a line and then you have to wait for the beat, or in stand-up comedy, you get the like da 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 da. You know, there's a certain rhythm that kind of happens. And now with Zoom, I've seen artists running classes on what's called the beat ping, right? Because now on Zoom, before you can wait for the beat, you actually have to wait for like the ping for your actual data to get delivered on the other side. So I'm seeing like comedians run different sort of master classes to recalibrate the rhythm of comedy that takes into account the lag of Zoom, in order not to degrade the beat, the comedic beat. So it's like crazy things that I've never thought about are kind of coming out of this. I'm not sure if that speaks to any of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think artists, certainly in this country, artists are strapped all the time. I mean, if you look at some of our visual arts, for example, you will see that there are more art forms made with recyclable materials than with oil paints. And the reason that is because the artists can't afford to buy the oil paints, and they are looking to find ways to make the work. So I think for them, they have an inherent need to make. And I think that nothing can stand in that way, really. I mean, even if they were to retrain and do something else, I think as human beings, they kind of have to get this thing out of them. So they will find a way to do it. I mean, the obvious ones are the technology stuff, which I must say are substantially less interesting to me as in the creative industries, because it is just taking a work and changing the form. And I don't think that it always works. So in my first degree is actually in theatre, and we used to talk quite a lot about form and function. You know, and if you hold a theatre production in the theatre, that same production would feel very different if you held it in a parking lot, because our expectations of the theatre and the parking lot are different. I think what we have struggled with a little bit, which Kutlwano spoke to, is just coming to terms with what the technology can or can't do for us. So a lot of the art fairs have moved their stuff online, but what it initially looked like was just pages and pages and pages and pages of artwork. And after page like 15, you can't do it, especially after a full day of work on Zoom and emails and whatever. People don't have the capacity. So I think we are trying to navigate around that form and function kind of question, but I literally don't think it's going to stop producers needing to produce, whatever that means. I mean, obviously an artist always wants an audience to see their work. There is a level of validation in that process. But even if you're not there, like during hard lockdown, our artists were still working. They were still in their studios doing their thing by themselves. So for them, it's kind of a compulsion. They can't stop almost. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah. So we've actually come to the end of this of our time slot here. I've been listening so avidly that I missed my mark as a host to draw it to a close. But we've had some very interesting comments and questions. We haven't been able to answer all the questions. But I just want to end with a comment from Lorette, who says, resilience has been a very crucial aspect in the last 2 years, but even this has become a buzzword and is just used as a band-aid to cope with any setbacks, not dealing with mindsets, emotions, and other aspects of the psyche. And I would just like to say that I completely concur with that sometimes we put into situations where we start to think about this as normative, and we gloss over what it actually means to have to deal with the lived and ongoing experience. Just be resilient. It's like telling a person with mental health issues, just get over it. It's not, exactly. And something that I just want to share as we close, we ask our students to create it's a creative portfolio of evidence of their learning over the year, and we get them to share some of their own creative processes. To some students upload art or music and so on and so forth. And one student added a quote, which I thought was quite telling. It said, by John Keating, if you remember Dead Poets Society, and in medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are arts. These are what we stay alive for. And I think we can say the same with our discussions today. It's what keeps us alive and keeps us going, and why artists and musicians are so important to the condition, the human condition. As I close, can I hand over perhaps just to our speakers for any closing remarks, and then we will end the discussion.
Sorry, Stephen, I do see there's a lot of passion about a jazz question.
Right. One second.
If that can be addressed in 1 minute, sorry.
Sure, I'll ask the question all the same from Maredi about jazz, and I think the question is about why we don't have jazz, or jazz is being underutilized or under performed at WITS. Just 1 second, I've got to just scroll through the questions. Why is there a drought of jazz music at WITS School of Arts? I don't know if we're really positioned to answer that, but perhaps Kutlwano, you have some thoughts.
Jazz is an acquired taste, as is classical music. I think it's the question is a historical one, and by that I mean the bits that I went to was a conservatoire kind of university, which really sought to train classical music and educators, and jazz was kind of a cousin of that. I don't want to say a stepsister or anything, but a cousin of that. That was loved. In fact, was called contemporary and popular music. It wasn't called jazz specifically. And at other universities like UCT and certainly UKZN, they have had and have always had in the last 50 years certainly very strong jazz programs. So I think it's again, you could ask the same perhaps about another university like University of the Free State, or Stellenbosch, where there were more conservatoires churning out really good pianists and classical pianists and cellists and violinists, etc. So it's more of a historical one. So if you wanted to study jazz, you didn't come to this, you went elsewhere. I think that's, it wasn't what they were known for. But as a closing remark, while I'm on the mic, Steve, if I may, really interesting thoughts. Thank you, Sarah and Gavin, I really enjoyed your engagements with each other, and I think wellness is central also to creating beautiful art, or any art. Even if, you know, we could say it's just as a turn of phrase to say, oh man, it's way out there. It's crazy what he came up with. But there has to be a level of wellness because the person needs to be managed. I often speak when I'm on air, whenever I play a track by Robert Schumann, who suffered debilitating mental illness. I mean, he would be in bed for weeks. But when the sun was out for him, as it were, he wrote just the most delightful music. And if he hadn't spent weeks on end in bed, uh, the course of classical music even might have changed. So our wellness is very key, and some of the things that have come out, people working in isolation, people, and I speak about people like me, who then when you get an opportunity to do a gig, you stand in front of the orchestra and you wonder if you are still doing it properly. Whether, you know, so you end up spending half the rehearsal over explaining because you wonder if you're still able to communicate it when you're making music. Stephen, I'm sure you like it. So it's just about getting all of that back, and hopefully with the cloud also lifting, that our creatives would also be in a better space, because when we don't have healthy artists, we don't have a healthy society.
Very true. Any closing remarks from Sarah and Gavin?
No, just thank you so much. Thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to Stephen and Catherine and Smunkeliso for arranging everything. Yeah, and I just want to encourage everyone to be creative. You often hear people going, I'm not creative, I wish I was creative. And then you look at how beautiful and creative their garden is, or how amazingly they cook, or how they style themselves, or the way they engage at birthday parties. It's like everyone is creative. To not be creative is to literally die. In French, you know, you talk about breath as inspiration, right? You inspire, right? It's breath, inspiration, creativity. It's life. It's your breath. And so go out there and just be creative, even if that is just cooking or whatever. Just because life is too short to be in a Zoom room. Yeah.
I think I'd like to the lady who asked about resilience, and to Kutlana's point, I think that we as creatives may have some tricks, practical tricks, to share with the world on how to help people to be resilient. I'm not saying that in and of ourselves and as a community, we also don't need looking after, but there are some wonderful, fun things like breathing exercises and running around a room calling a banana a spade, and things that you can do that take your mind and your mental health away from the struggles that are immediately at hand, because it's not just about doing something fun. Creativity is actually integral, as Gavin said, to life. And if you are unable to find whatever that thing is for yourself to do, the resilience is far harder to keep getting up every morning. And on that note, I would also like to thank all the speakers and also just to the team for putting this together, because I do think that these kinds of conversations across these disciplines are hugely valuable for us to start thinking about how we can create a world that is better for all of us, using the tools that are allowed to us, but also drawing some lines in the sand about what we can and can't do and what we're willing to do as human beings in the short lifespan we have.
Thank you for those final comments. We've taken liberties with our attendees, going 10 minutes over, but it was a wonderful discussion. And I'd like to thank you again, Sarah, Gavin, and Kutlwano, for your time. So have a good afternoon, everyone. Let's go out there and be creative, and let's remember our artists and musicians. And for those of you who can see the screen, just a reminder that next week we have a very exciting and interesting discussion called A Domestic Revolution, City Life in a Pandemic. with Dr. Ngaka Mosiane and Miriam Yana. And it's going to be hosted by Feroza Mutara in our own department in emergency medicine.